Thank you, Professor. I think that was a fascinating talk, and you gave us a peek into her life, and how she was as a person, not only just as a prime minister, and how she handled, the situation, especially during the 1973 war. If one looks at, those times, there were a lot of, even though Israel was not really having any relations with the Arab countries, but obviously there would be a lot of discussion at the diplomatic level and all that. So how was she, and especially her history before the formation of Israel with Jordan, how was she perceived in the Arab countries, in Arab capitals? Uh, if you can perhaps throw some light, and also,
Yes.
yeah. Please go on, sir.
Theoretically, Israel was isolated from the Arab world, from the Muslim world, since its inception. The truth is somewhat different. Somebody once asked an Israeli leader, I think it was Moshe Sharet, the second prime minister, how long have you known King Hussein? He said, I knew him since he was 3 years old, sitting on the lap of his grandfather. In other words, King Hussein was a known entity since he was a small child. Golda Meir will be remembered, among other things, for her 2 meetings with King Abdullah of Jordan. The first was 2 weeks before the partition resolution, the United Nations Resolution 181, 29 November 1947. She met him in order basically to lay down certain ideas. Nothing was written, nothing was signed, nothing was sealed. The general idea was King Abdullah would let the Jews establish their state, and the Jews would let him keep what is today the West Bank. We weren't sure about Jerusalem yet, but they left it as it is. But nothing written. He was not overjoyed with the fact that the Jews sent him a woman, but they said to him, this is the senior person that we have. Sharet was in the United States, he couldn't come. The next meeting was 4 days before Israel proclaimed its independence. The British informed the Jewish leadership that maybe it's a good idea if you go and see Abdullah again, because if he made a commitment at the time not to become involved in an attack against the future Jewish state, he has now had second thoughts, and might be a good idea if you find out exactly what his intentions are. And the meeting was arranged, and she dressed as an Arab woman, and she drove to Amman. She was a very brave woman. There were 2 people, she and her interpreter, and ended up in Amman, where the king said, yes, it's true that we had an arrangement, but things have changed. I'm no longer alone. I'm now one of 5. Why don't you postpone the Declaration of Independence? And he said to them, to her, look, you waited 2,000 years, wait a few more months. And she said, it's now or never. And came back and informed Ben Gurion about the conversation, and basically said to Ben Gurion, you've got to change all your strategy because you've got to include the Jordanian army. She met King Hussein after that in 1965 in Paris, and basically they reached an understanding that Jordan will quietly remain relatively passive when it comes to Arab-Israel, to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and there'll be an understanding on security, on water, and other things. This, unfortunately, did not prevent King Hussein from making probably the worst error he ever made, and that is joining Nasser in the June 1967 Six-Day War. She met him again as prime minister, I think 8 or 9 times. And they reached a working understanding, namely, Jordan will make sure that there will be no threat to Israel from the east, which is something they still adhere to. There would be clandestine trade relations. Jordan will allow Israeli Arabs to go through Jordan on their way to the Hajj in Mecca. Jordan will continue to pay salaries of officials in the West Bank. Jordan will write the exams, and we will administer the exams, and on the basis of this, students will be able to go and study in universities in Jordan. We had a common enemy, and that was Yasser Arafat, who almost toppled King Hussein in 1970. And Golda made sure that this would not happen. She, in fact, committed Israel to protecting King Hussein from both the Palestinians and the Syrians at the time. So she did establish that sort of relation. She knew also that Israel maintained working ties with Indonesia. We did have representation in India. We had a consulate general in Bombay. I remember that place very well. I'm not sure if they're still there. It's called Pedder Hill in Mumbai. We had developed ties, quite very good, solid ties with Turkey. And she went with Ben Gurion once to meet the Prime Minister of Turkey, Prime Minister or President, I forget. We had very good ties with Iran. Israel had very close relations with Iran from 1950 to 1979, when the Shah, the regime of the Shah collapsed. So it's not true to say that we were totally isolated. And we saw this last week with the suddenly decision to go public with relations that existed between Israel and the United Arab Emirates probably for the last 25 years. It's not something new. And the same applies to a few other Arab countries as well. You have, in diplomacy today, it's the clandestine that sometimes prevail over the covert operations. In the case of Israel, you have a foreign ministry, but you have another foreign ministry. It's called the Mossad. And they maintain our working relations. For example, Israel had very good relations with Morocco.
Yes.
From the early 50s to this very day. By the way, I was in Morocco 4 times. The last times 2 years ago, a conference organized by a Chinese institution. So we're still there, and we assume that soon these ties will be.
Yes. In fact, I saw, sorry to interrupt. In fact, I saw an article by an Israeli, commentator, which the article was saying that Moroccan diplomats would actually be angry at UAE that why did the UAE took lead or decided to normalize the relation before they actually decided. They were so close, or they are so close to that.
No, with Morocco, we've had very good working. Look, Morocco played a key role in the decision of Sadat to come to Jerusalem in 1977. And I'll remind you something else. When Israel signed the Oslo Accords, famous handshake between Rabin and Arafat on the White House lawn, with Clinton beaming. Clinton had nothing to do with the negotiations, but at least he reaped the credit. Trump can claim a bit more credit, and Trump wants to repeat the same exercise on the White House lawn. How he's going to do it with masks, I don't know, but we'll see what happens. With the Morocco, Israel maintained very good relations for another very important reason. There was a huge Jewish community in Morocco, well over 250,000, probably more. and we wanted to make sure nothing happens to them. And for that, look for, in order to get Jews out of countries of distress, Israel is going to go very far, as we did with the Soviet Union. So, probably one of Golda Meir's major achievements, when she was for 8 months Israeli minister plenipotentiary in Moscow. And when she arrived at the synagogue on New Year's Eve, Jewish New Year's Eve in Moscow, September 1948, 50,000 Jews greeted her, biggest demonstration since the Russian Revolution. And she lit the spark. And it came into fruition 40 years later. And today we have well over 1.25 million Russian Jews in Israel, who are very important in our every aspect of our life.
There are a few questions which have come, but before I come to those questions, maybe I can take this opportunity to invite Sri Jairam Ramesh if he has any questions or comments, to your points.
Well, thank you, Dr. Medzini, for a very fascinating presentation on a very fascinating personality. I've long been interested in Golda Meir because she overlapped with Indira Gandhi. And whatever you said about Golda Meir applies 100% to Indira Gandhi as well. And it's very interesting. It's not generally known in India that Golda Meir played a very decisive role in the supply of Israeli military equipment in late 1971, in the months leading up to our war with Pakistan. We got the
71 or 60, 65? No, 65 we did not.
I'm coming to 65, but in 71 she played a very important role
That is true.
as Prime Minister through intermediaries in London, and we got this equipment in October and November of 71, and the war was in December 71. But it's very interesting, Professor, that in 1965, she was not very keen on military equipment being supplied to India when Mr. Eshkol was the Prime Minister. And I think at that time, Golda Meir was the defense minister. She was not
foreign minister.
Foreign minister, sorry. She was not very keen. But in 71, she had changed her position as prime minister. Many reasons, could be Bangladesh, could be humanitarian, could be her intermediaries, could be she saw Indira Gandhi as a fellow woman, many reasons. But the fact is that in 65, she was opposed to it, but in 71,
was opposed.
She was a strong supporter in 71. So, I was very struck by.
I'll remind you something else. When she was foreign minister, Israel supplied India with shells.
Yes.
When you were fighting the Chinese.
In 62, absolutely.
62.
Yeah.
That was the first time India applied, asked for, and Golda approved.
Yes. In fact,
selling India equipment.
This is what I find intriguing. In 62, we get the equipment. In 65, she's not very hot on it. In fact, she opposes Mr. Eshkol's decision. But in 71, Professor, she is all out, complete full throat support. And in fact, the Knesset passes this resolution against Pakistani genocide in East Pakistan. And a lot of the credit must actually go to Golda Meir. So she is, I've been long fascinated with her. The question that I have of you is, what was the relationship between her and Kissinger? Because in 73,
yes, he played a very key role. Look, he himself wrote a great deal about her in his memoirs. And he said she, to me, was a sort of an aunt, that you have to be very careful to please the aunt. I'll tell you one anecdote that I was a witness to. We were negotiating the Syrian disengagement agreement after the Yom Kippur War. And it took a hell of a long time, lasted a whole month, and Kissinger was going back and forth from Damascus to Jerusalem. At one point, the negotiations were sort of on the rocks. And Golda looked at Kissinger and said, "Mr. Secretary, what do you want from me? I'm an old woman. I was born in the 19th century." And he looked at her and he said to her, "Madam Prime Minister, the 19th century is my specialty." In other words, he had written his thesis in a very good book. It's called The World Restored, about the Congress of Vienna. And that, of course, diffused the whole thing. They had a very, very good relationship. And he said to her once, "I'm first an American, and then first I'm a professor, and then I'm American, and then I'm Secretary of State. Finally, I'm a Jew." And she said, "It's all right. In Hebrew, we write from right to left." So she didn't want to stress this thing of Jewish, but I'll tell you another story if I've got the time. Kissinger, in Jerusalem, we have the Yad Vashem. That's a memorial to the Holocaust. And he'd been to Israel many times. I met him first time at Harvard in 1960, when he was a professor there. And before, there was a Geneva Peace Conference. Before the conference, Golda said to him, "You're not leaving the country before you go to Yad Vashem." He said, "All right, I have to go." I go. He sent the press to the plane to wait for him, and he went alone. So I tagged along with the Israeli team, and we come to Yad Vashem. They have a section, it's called the section of the communities, the books of the communities. Each community was destroyed by the Nazis. And he was, "Where are you from?" He said, "I'm from Fürth." And I said, "Fine." So pulled out the book of Fürth. And they looked under Kissinger. And there was Fritz and this one and that one. He said, "My uncles, my cousins." In other words, there were about 10 or 11 Kissingers who were killed, exterminated by the Nazis. And that apparently, in fact, affected him very much. Well, when you see it black and white, and you remember who you are. I remember he said "We can't let Israel down." And in retrospect, he did not let Israel down. He did some very, very good things.
Great, thank you.
But I'll never forget our first meeting. It was a lunch at the faculty club at Harvard. Don't remember how I got there. I think with a friend of mine who was a student of his. And he said, we talked about Palestinians. This is 1960. He said, "There is no end to their grievance." And I think he was right then, and he's certainly right now. Next question.
Yes. Professor, there is a question by Professor Sabah Nicoliani, who is in Concordia University in Canada. He asks, How do you explain his Golda Meir's poor relationship with the Black Panthers? Lo Nehmadim. How do you deal with this issue in the book?
I say openly in the book, and I declare that I am partly guilty for that. I'll tell you why. There was a meeting between her and the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers, those who don't know, were Israelis, young Israelis, most of them from families that originated either from North Africa or from Arab countries. Many of them were not working, clashes with the police, enormous sense of bias and prejudice against them, difficult for them to find suitable jobs, education, and poverty. And eventually she was persuaded to meet them. We thought that she spent years and years in the trade union. There was no need to prepare her for that. And they walk in, and the first question she said to them, where do you work? And they said, we don't work. Why don't you work? Because we can't find jobs, and the police is persecuting us. And instead of pursuing this further, she then launched into a long tirade about when we came to Palestine in 1921, we did this, that, and the other, and that was the last thing they were interested in. And that turned into a disaster, which she compounded by saying about them, in Hebrew it's Hem lo nechmadim, they're not nice. And that haunted her for the rest of her life. In other words, and I mention this in the book very much, she became prime minister at the age of 71. At 71, you don't change. And therefore, views that you had when you were 50 years younger and so on still remain with you. There are very few world leaders who change at this age. Among them, de Gaulle, who pulled France out of Algeria. I would imagine Adenauer, probably Willy Brandt, probably Yitzhak Rabin with the Oslo Accords. It is rare that people that age change. He did not change. And she became prime minister of a country that was different from the one that she knew years earlier. A country with different ideas, different values, younger generation that wanted to have to enjoy life, car, jobs, overseas trips, education, restaurants, nightclubs, and so on. This is something she was totally unfamiliar with. And she could not understand that she is the prime minister of a new, highly technological, industrialized society. And that was a tragedy, and there was not much we could do about this. But on the Black Panthers, I still consider myself partly responsible for that disastrous meeting.
Thank you, Professor, for that, I think, very, very elaborate answer. There is another question by Al White, who is with the Middle East Institute here in India. He asks, can you please give a brief on Golda Meir's contribution towards establishing contacts with the Kurds?
With
Kurds. The Kurds.
With the Kurds. I'll say the following. After the Sinai War, 1956, Ben-Gurion and some of his advisors came to the conclusion Israel must adopt a policy which became known as the policy of the periphery. Israel should concentrate relations with Ethiopia, Turkey, and Iran, and seek paths to minorities in the Middle East. Among them, in Lebanon, the Maronites. From Iran, we reached out to the Kurds. And there was a big Israeli presence in that area. We trained them, we helped them, we armed them. And all this was done with the full knowledge of both Iran and the United States. Now, she supported the idea, which started in late 50s when she was foreign minister. I don't think she's ever been to Iran, but she was once in Turkey and she was in Ethiopia. In other words, she very much supported this concept of the periphery. And from the periphery, you could do all sorts of things that you couldn't do. In other words, my immediate neighbors are my enemies, my neighbors are my friends. In many respects, this is what we're doing today. Syria is not exactly a friendly country, and therefore Iraq technically is still at war with Israel, and therefore you leapfrog, and you go to Oman, to Bahrain, to United Arab Emirates, and so on. And that was the concept then. In 1975, for reasons which I still do not remember, the Americans asked us to hands off the Kurds, and together with the Persians, with the Iranians. And we, I regret to say, abandoned the Kurds. 1975. Today, there are again strong ties and connections. I personally met once Mullah Mustafa Barazani, who was in Israel in the mid-60s.
Thank you, Professor. There is another question, Ambassador Sanjay Singh, who has been India's ambassador to Iran. Sir, if you are here, would you like to ask the question, or? So maybe I can perhaps ask the question. He wanted to ask if there is if you have any knowledge of any direct contacts between Golda Meir and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. If you recollect anything related to that.
No, I do not have any. I know one thing. When Golda Meir was Minister Plenipotentiary in Moscow, 1948-49, she inherited the building in which Nehru's sister, who was the Indian ambassador in Moscow at the time, Golda inherited the building that Mrs. Gandhi, forget her name, Nehru's sister, she inherited. I don't think there was any connection between Golda Meir and Indira Gandhi. Speaking of women prime minister, there was once or twice a meeting with I witnessed between Margaret Thatcher and Golda Meir. Thatcher, I think, was then Minister of Education in the United Kingdom, and she came to Israel, and she was a great admirer of Golda Meir. But apart from that, I don't remember any connection with the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, who was also a woman Prime Minister at the time, or with other women who were in job. Look, Golda was not a feminist. You'll be amazed to hear she had no women in her cabinet. There were 2 or 3 women ambassadors when she was foreign minister. She stayed away from the feminist movement, didn't believe in it, and there was always a saying, the only man in the Ben-Gurion cabinet is Golda Meir, and she disliked that intensely. She didn't like this. Men think it's a compliment. It's not a compliment.
Yeah.
But look, she had a very difficult personal life. She sacrificed her personal life for career, party, movement, and country. She never divorced, but she lived apart from her husband for many, many years, and raised her 2 children more or less as a single mother. So she knew what it meant to be a working single parent. And this we saw later on in her social legislation.
Professor, there is a question by Professor Joseph Kishishian, who is sitting in Beirut.
Yes.
He asks, can you compare Golda Meir with Menahem Begin? His own words, who was the meanest of the 2? Perhaps, you take the...
In terms of being mean to people, she was meaner than Begin. Begin was not mean. I knew Begin, not well. I met him a number of times. He was not mean. And he was not petty. And he was not vicious. Look, once again, he came to power. He lost 9 elections before he finally made it in 1977. By then, he was not well. He had problems. He was probably manic depressive. He has his highs and lows. And luckily, he had his highs when Sadat was here and when we negotiated with Egypt. He, as prime minister, he left 3 or 4 very important legacies. The first, of course, was the peace with Egypt, which is holding 40 years later. The second was the attack on the Iraqi nuclear facility near Baghdad in 1981. The third major achievement was domestic in Israel, and that is rehabilitation of 160 neighborhoods which were deprived, which were poor neighborhoods. And the government and World Jewry put together a huge amount of funds in order to try and rehabilitate these things. I would say these 3 things, he would go down in history. And but then came the war in Lebanon, and that more or less destroyed him and his government.
So, since you earlier mentioned about the, her own inclination to not towards, feminist politics, but there is a question exactly on the same. But adding to that, what was her contribution to, the participation of women in the defense sector or military, the IDF in Israel, if you can?
She strongly believed that they should serve, but she was not prepared to go against the ultra-Orthodox parties. And they, of course, totally oppose women serving in the army. And therefore, she supported the more or less a compromise. They would not serve in the army in uniform, but they would be allowed to do what's called national duty. Help out in hospitals, community centers, offices, and so on. Here, she followed Ben-Gurion. The attitude towards the ultra-Orthodox parties was fashioned by Ben-Gurion, and she decided it's not worth a big fight. In fact, none of Israel's prime ministers felt that this was worth it. And you can see it started with Ben-Gurion, who agreed that, I think at the time it was about 200 or 300 religious students would not be required to do military duty. Today, the number is about 40 or 50,000, and therefore it's too late. And part of the rift in Israeli society today is over equal duty, equal responsibility. In other words, you've got tens of thousands of young Israelis who do not do military service. And not only women, but also men. And that is one of the many facets of the current crisis in our society. And they are protected by ultra-Orthodox parties who usually are the balance, who hold the key to any ruling coalition. And most prime ministers felt that they did not want to risk a rift. And Golda Meir was among them. Although she was a secular Jew, she rode on the Sabbath, rarely went to synagogue, smoked like mad on the Sabbath, and she loved Chinese food. I remember after the 56 war, she was in New York. I was a student in New York at the time, and she was assigned a bodyguard, Secret Service bodyguard. And we asked her once, how is he? She said, he's a wonderful man. He knows all the good Chinese restaurants in New York. And she loved Chinese food. So, but she did not want to argue. She didn't want to make a case.
Thank you, sir. There's a question. Shri Tarun Vijay, who is a former member of the Rajya Sabha, the upper house of Parliament in India, he asks, what was her views on the delay in establishing diplomatic relations by India, and but was hesitant to say, and what were the factors that made her help in terms of come India, as we were discussing earlier regarding the
Look, Israel, I would say this applies not only to her, it applies to most prime ministers. Israel understood the position of India, namely Arab votes in the UN, the problem of Pakistan, the problem of a huge Muslim minority in India, trade with Arab countries, which Nehru explained on many occasions, not only to Israelis, but also to others. But the feeling was that Nehru, being a major international figure, not only the Prime Minister of India, he was in fact one of the leaders of so-called Third World. We expected more of him. And this came, we saw this particularly in 1955, when the Third World organized a conference in Bandung, to which Israel was not invited. Now, the three major figures were Zhou Enlai of China, Nehru of India, and Nasser of Egypt. And we asked Nehru about that. He said, we were told plainly by the Arab countries, if Israel comes, we don't come. And we felt that we wanted a broader participation. So we understood, but we expected more. Expected more partly because of the doctrines that Nehru preached. That is peace and stability and understanding and brotherhood and so on. But you listen, on the one hand, you have the harsh reality, but then you also have certain ideals, certain values that we thought should apply universally, and not only that. But I think she did not exhaust any opportunity to pass word to the Indian government. And she may have felt in 1971, if Israel supports India in a just cause, then maybe this will make a difference in Indian policy.
Thank you. I think that was really a very detailed answer. There is a question regarding the Israeli Labour Party and how far they kind of miss the leadership of people like Golda Meir and those who were before her. And maybe I can add perhaps a point or two of my own here. How is she in the wider Israeli politics, and in terms of even within the Labour Party, how is she remembered? I mean, for example, everybody remembers David Ben Gurion as the architect of modern Israel. So how is Golda Meir remembered in Israeli politics, especially in Labour Party? And perhaps I can add another point. Why is it that we don't have any other woman leader becoming prime minister in Israel in the last 70 years?
We almost had one, a woman called Tzipi Livni, who was a very impressive lady, and she may in the future become prime minister. Golda Meir was among the founders of the Labour Party in 1930. Look, at the age of 32, she was one of the 20 most influential people in the country. Together with Ben Gurion, she was a top personality in the trade union movement. And she will be remembered for her involvement in finding jobs, employment, housing, labor laws, during the time when she was Minister of Construction and Labor and Construction. The tragedy was when she became Foreign Minister, her attention was focused on foreign affairs.
Mm.
She was away from country quite often. When she became Prime Minister, her key focus was security and foreign policy. In other words, the war of attrition, relations with America, the pressure on Israel to withdraw without any arrangement, without any agreement. She always used to say, if they won't talk to us, how would they live with us? And therefore, she probably is partly responsible for the slow rot, the slow sclerosis that began to affect the party, which happens to every living organism, happens to political parties as well. You become rigid, you lose your flexibility. You don't respond quickly to needs of your voters and of others. And during the time when she was Prime Minister, a great deal of rot began to beset the party. And you begin to have, on rare occasions, issues of corruption. And she could not bear to deal with these issues because you have to go down to grassroots, to party, local party leaders and others. And one day she had to deal with Nixon, and the next day she had to deal with a Labour Party leader in Beersheba. I mean, that was a bit much more, but regrettably, that absorbed her attention. Unlike Begin, who continued to be a party leader, more or less until he resigned in 1983. So, and she was aware of it. That was a tragedy. She knew that she was losing grip over the party and that the party was losing grip over the country, which is what happened. She lived to see the day when they lost the hegemony, they lost leadership of the country.
Thank you. So, Sri Jairam Ramesh wanted to react to the point you were mentioning about the Bandung conference. So, over to you, sir.
Professor, regarding Bandung, I
Yes.
just point out I have a new biography of Krishna Menon that has come out. And I discovered in Krishna Menon's archives that both Nehru and Krishna Menon were very keen on getting Israel into the Bandung conference. Pakistan was dead against China being invited. You know, these are historical ironies. But in 55, Nehru made more than one effort to convince Nasser that, you know, Israel should be invited. And there is some correspondence that's there in the Krishna Menon archives. But you're right. You know, when push came to shove, India did not make it, you know, a make or break issue. But I do want to say that there is archival evidence to show that India made more than a cursory effort to get Israel into Bandung. But, you know, the majority view was that Israel should not be invited, and India went along with that view. Now, one could argue that India should have put its foot down and, you know, given the stature of Nehru, you know, would have got its way. But it didn't happen. But it was not for any lack of effort on India's side.
I imagine you're right. But in retrospect, the Bandung conference, or rather the fact that Israel was not invited or participated in Bandung conference, probably one of the major diplomatic setbacks of Israel in its entire 72 years of existence. I see my friend Kumar looking at me.
Yes. No, I think everyone would agree that we had a really fascinating, you know, discussion on on this book by Professor Medzini, and I think we are all enriched today. And we had some really good interventions from Sri Jayaram Ramesh, and then there were many other questions from Professor Kishishian and all. May I now request Sir to say the final words?